Long before European empires rose to power, Africa's kingdoms were thriving, wealthy, and sophisticated. The Mali Empire controlled gold mines that made Europe's riches pale in comparison, and the Ghana Empire dominated the trans-Saharan trade routes. So why do we hear so little about this in history books? Because European powers spent centuries erasing that history, exploiting Africa's wealth for their gain. In this video, we reveal how the systematic looting of Africa's richest kingdoms still affects the continent today. Stay with us to uncover the untold truth. Disclaimer: this video is for educational purposes only. Let's take a journey back in time. In the vast deserts of the Sahara, the lush green forests of West Africa, and the great rivers that snake their way across the continent, beneath the surface, hidden away in the annals of history, were some of the richest and most powerful kingdoms the world has ever seen. Before European explorers arrived, kingdoms like Mali, Ghana, and Songhai were the epitome of wealth and sophistication. They controlled vast trade networks that spanned from the depths of Africa to the coasts of the Mediterranean and beyond. The gold that glistened in European treasuries? Much of it came from Africa's rich soils. The ivory, salt, and precious metals that adorned royal courts? These too were from the heart of Africa. The Kingdom of Mali, for example, was a beacon of prosperity. Its ruler, Mansa Musa, is widely regarded as one of the wealthiest individuals to have ever lived. During his famous pilgrimage to Mecca in 1324, Mansa Musa reportedly gave away so much gold that it caused inflation across the regions he passed through. His wealth was beyond imagination, and his kingdom was a hub for trade, scholarship, and culture. The city of Timbuktu, which lay within his empire, was a center for learning, where scholars from across the world came to study mathematics, astronomy, law, and more. Yet despite the opulence and power these kingdoms held, their stories are often forgotten, overshadowed by the grandeur of European empires. But then, the tide changed. The 15th century marked the arrival of European powers along Africa's coast, with Portugal leading the way. At first, these European traders were primarily interested in goods like gold, ivory, and spices. They marveled at the wealth of these African kingdoms, but their curiosity soon turned into greed. The Portuguese, with their advanced naval technology, began establishing forts and trading posts along the West African coast. What started as peaceful trade partnerships soon morphed into something much darker. The Europeans didn't just want to trade, they wanted to control the sources of Africa's wealth. Over time, they began infiltrating these kingdoms, slowly taking over their trade routes and resources. They were looking for human capital. Thus began one of the darkest chapters in human history, the transatlantic slave trade. The transatlantic slave trade was more than just a commercial enterprise. It was a systematic dehumanization of an entire continent. Over the course of more than 3 decades, it's estimated that 12 million Africans were forcibly taken from their homelands and shipped across the Atlantic Ocean to work on plantations in the Americas. Millions more would perish during the brutal journey known as the Middle Passage. And who were the masterminds behind this trade? European powers like Portugal, Britain, France, and Spain. The profits they made were astronomical, and the consequences for Africa were catastrophic. The continent was left stripped of its young and able-bodied people, its communities shattered, and its economic and cultural fabric torn apart. It's important to note that Africa's kingdoms weren't passive victims. Many African rulers resisted European encroachment, and some even tried to negotiate with the Europeans to protect their interests. But the imbalance of power was too great. European nations, driven by the wealth they were amassing from African resources, became unstoppable juggernauts. Kingdoms that had stood tall for centuries were now crumbling under the weight of colonial exploitation. Fast forward to the 19th century, European powers had tasted the riches of Africa, and they wanted more. Enter the infamous Berlin Conference of 1884, where European leaders gathered to carve up Africa like a pie. Without a single African representative in the room, these powers drew arbitrary borders and made deals that would determine the fate of African nations for centuries to come. The so-called Scramble for Africa had begun. This was a period of intense colonial competition, where European nations vied for control over African territories. Each European power wanted a piece of the pie, and they were willing to use any means necessary to get it. Britain, for example, took control of Egypt and Sudan, securing a crucial route to India via the Suez Canal. For African kingdoms, the Scramble for Africa was a disaster. They were forced to cede control over their territories, resources, and people. The rich, vibrant societies that had once thrived were now under the yoke of colonial rule. The wealth of Africa, which had once belonged to its people, was now being funneled into European coffers. Colonialism left a deep and lasting scar on Africa. The wealth that had once flowed through the hands of African kings and queens was now being extracted to build European empires. Gold, diamonds, rubber, and other precious resources were shipped overseas, leaving African nations impoverished and struggling to rebuild. But it wasn't just the material wealth that was stolen. The cultural and intellectual wealth of Africa was also systematically dismantled. European colonizers often portrayed African societies as primitive and backward to justify their exploitation. In reality, these societies had complex political systems, rich cultural traditions, and sophisticated economies long before the Europeans arrived. Even the education systems in African colonies were designed to serve European interests. African children were taught European languages, European history, and European values, while their own rich histories were erased or diminished. The goal was clear: to create a generation of Africans who would serve the colonial system rather than challenge it. Today, the legacy of this exploitation is still felt across Africa. Many African nations continue to grapple with the political, economic, and social challenges that colonialism left behind. Arbitrary borders drawn by European powers have led to ethnic conflicts and political instability. Economic systems that were designed to extract resources for European benefit have left African countries dependent on the export of raw materials, with little infrastructure for manufacturing or innovation. But despite these challenges, there is resilience. African nations have fought for and won their independence, and today, many are working to reclaim their cultural heritage and rebuild their economies. The stories of Africa's richest kingdoms are being rediscovered and celebrated, offering a new perspective on the continent's history. The truth is, Africa was never a passive victim in its own history. Its kingdoms were powerful, its people were resourceful, and its cultures were rich. The exploitation of Africa's wealth by European powers is a dark chapter, but it's not the whole story. The legacies of Mali, Ghana, Benin, and other African kingdoms live on, and their contributions to world history are undeniable. As we reflect on the systematic looting of Africa's wealth by European powers, it's important to remember that history is not just about the past. It shapes the present and the future. Africa's story is one of resilience, strength, and perseverance. Its kingdoms may have been exploited, but their legacy endures. Now, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this historical injustice in the comments below. Do you think Africa's rich history is adequately represented in global narratives? Let's start a conversation. And if you're interested in learning more, don't forget to check out our other videos. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content like this.